Hey, this is a video for 2.1, Introduction to Biodiversity. So go ahead and check out the overview and set up your guided notes. So some basics about biodiversity is we have this acronym that can basically explain where or sources of biodiversity loss, and it's HIPCO. And instead of saying something is bad for the environment, like don't ever say that in this, ever. Say that it contributes to biodiversity loss. That is the generic answer. And one of these, you either have habitat loss or habitat destruction, you have invasive species, you can have pollution, climate change, and overharvesting. Overharvesting is like deforestation, it's like overfishing. Some sources may have another P, and that's population. I personally disagree with it because with the human population growth, you could technically have population growth if it's done sustainably, where you're not actually contributing to biodiversity loss. That really doesn't happen because humans don't really know how to do a lot of these things. So biodiversity, we can have genetic diversity, and that's diversity within a population. We can have species diversity, and that's the number and abundance of different types of organisms. And we can also have ecosystem diversity, and that is the different varieties of habitats. Now, all of these can contribute to biodiversity, which then can help an ecosystem respond to stress. Because if you have more species interactions, it will be better able to respond to an environmental stressor. And it also contributes to ecosystem services, which are the human benefits, and we'll talk about that in a future video. So genetic diversity. For starters, you have the segment of DNA. You have part of that DNA, which is a gene, and a gene is a segment of DNA that controls the production of one protein. So the genotype, and this word you might see it, you might not have to memorize it. I haven't really seen it show up a lot, but the genotype is the sequence of bases that make up a genes. So the genotype is actually the DNA bases, the nitrogenous bases and their sequence. And that's going to indicate what specific gene is used and what protein is produced. Now, phenotype is the physical appearance based on those traits. So the genotype might be like AT, CC, GG, whatever, and the phenotype is red fur, okay, or blue feathers, something. So the different phenotypes will mean that there are more traits. And if you have, again, genetic diversity, they will have positive or favorable adaptations, which can enable them to survive environmental stressors. Now, if you ever have a change in that DNA can produce a different protein, and that protein can also result in different traits that are produced. So one little change up in the DNA can actually lead to a different phenotype, and this is one of the driving forces in evolution. And if it is a mutation that is passed on because it's maybe present in the sperm or in the eggs, it can contribute to evolution. Now we have two different ways of measuring biodiversity. We have species richness and species evenness. So richness is the number of species present in an ecosystem. This has high richness, this one has low richness. And then evenness is basically the balance of the individuals. These on the top have low evenness, these have high evenness. Now, bottleneck effect is something that can contribute to biodiversity loss. So I'm going to show you based on this little example. So let's just assume that each one of these little colored circles represents a species and their relative abundance. So in the original population, we had really pretty much mostly red and white and a few blue. But now a bottleneck effect just means that there's an environmental stressor, like maybe a forest fire, or something where not all of the organisms were able to survive. So in here, we have most of the organisms will die off. And if you notice, the only ones, because it's going like through a bottleneck, so it's very difficult for all of the organisms to survive. So the ones that do survive, it's going to have a reduced diversity. And that's because very few of them might be adapted to survive. So maybe the red ones and most of the white ones were not really able to survive this environmental stressor. Maybe it was climate change, maybe it was a flood, maybe it was a forest fire, maybe there was just increased competition. So over time, the population will actually be different. So you're going to see a lot more blue in this new population than we did in the original population, which had a lot of red. So this can lead to extinction if they are susceptible to the environmental stressors. Or maybe there's a different environmental stressor that comes by and will wipe out this new population. Sometimes it can also allow them to survive, but you are definitely reducing diversity overall when you have a bottleneck effect. Another impact of biodiversity is inbreeding depression. So inbreeding depression can reduce biodiversity because you have similar DNA segments. When you have inbreeding depression, you can increase the number of mutations because they can pass along these recessive genes. If you look here, this has basically not much diversity because it's literally only 2 basic types of organisms. There's far more diversity in the bottom population. So if you have these increased mutations, they may be susceptible to environmental stressors. Now, the founder effect is something else that does kind of show up, and it's kind of related to related to the bottleneck effect. It's also related to inbreeding depression. Because when you have the founder effect, you're basically reducing the genetic diversity whenever a small group is separated from a larger population. So if we had one area, one island that had, these 4 types of birds, and then one of the birds maybe migrated to another island, well, this is going to be a small population. Granted, it's not one bird. If we had a small population migrate, there's going to be definitely an inbreeding depression. But now over time, we're literally going to see a lot of these bluebirds appearing. So the genetic diversity will definitely be reduced from the original population. So this is typically seen as a reduction in biodiversity, and more often than not, it will probably have negative effects. But it's kind of based on the situation, whether it's positive or negative. Now, ecosystem resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to absorb stressors and continue to function. So when you have an environmental stressor, let's consider this ecosystem. Oh, there's my dog. Okay, this is like a pine forest. This is actually near my hometown. This was a couple years ago. And then we have this nice little tropical area. This was taken in Belize a few years ago. Now, in here, which one of these would be more resilient? Basically, what you've got to think about is when you have increased diversity, there's going to be more connections between different organisms. When you have more connections, they will better respond to an environmental stressor, which means that they'll recover faster because there will be a higher number of survivors. In this ecosystem, if something came and killed the pine trees, like all of these pine trees may be dying off because they have such similar genetic information. Okay, but there might be some survivors in here, so this ecosystem would have a higher resilience because, again, there is more diversity. So I would like you to respond to this check for understanding. And now we're going to practice with the FRQ. Notice we have 2 populations, population A and population B. So I want you to respond to this. Assuming that each colored circle represents a unique species, justify which ecosystem would better survive an environmental stressor. I hope that this video was informative. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you soon.